Chan, and you are watching Slanted Media's first ever interview. I'm being joined now by a controversial former New York Congressman from Staten Island who is staging a Capitol Hill comeback. Joining me now, none other than Mr. Michael Grimm. Congressman, thank you so much for being with us for the kickoff of Slanted Online today. First, let me ask you this. You are known to be outspoken, brash, even controversial. How does it feel for people to think of you as sort of the bad boy of Capitol Hill?
Well, first of all, let me start by saying congratulations. It's an honor for me to be part of this kickoff, and I'm really excited for you, and I wish you much success. I think that it's not so much that I'm the bad boy of Capitol Hill. I just think that, before Donald Trump ran, I was one of those rare candidates that spoke frankly and directly and didn't forget where I came from. Part of it, I think, is because I was never. And one of the things that I was disenfranchised about politicians, so to speak, is that they give you political jargon and double talk. That they speak out of both sides of their mouth, and you never really know what they're saying. And I think that's all by design because they don't want to lock themselves into anything. I try to break that mold.
So I want to clear up for people that might be watching now. You weren't only a suit on Capitol Hill, right? You're a former Marine. You're a former FBI agent. You were also a local businessman. Now, after you had this sort of egregious, on their part, run-in with the law, putting that incident behind you, many people would think that you would want to return to a more private, a more quiet civilian life. Why are you running for office again? What is driving you?
Well, that's what makes me different in a way. A lot of people said the exact same thing several other times in my life. So we go back to when I was a teenager. I had a partial college scholarship. For all intents and purposes, I had a decent job. For my age, I had a good life, and it looked like I was going to have a very successful future. So why? There was no war. There was no draft like in Vietnam.
Yeah.
Why join the Marine Corps? And then why, after I joined and the Persian Gulf War breaks out, why volunteer for combat? And the answer is simple. I've always had a burning desire to serve our country. It's always been in me, almost like a calling to serve. So that's why I joined the Marine Corps. That's why I enlisted. That's why I was in combat. But in addition to that, I came back. I was working towards my accounting and finance degrees, working on Wall Street, starting to make good money. And it was obvious I was going to have a very lucrative career on Wall Street when I had the opportunity to become a special agent of the FBI. And again, people said to me, the starting salary then was somewhere around $33,000 a year, where I could be making $20,000 to $25,000 a month at the job that I had. And everyone, again, said, why would you do such a thing? The answer was the same. I still loved serving. I enjoyed it at a level that it was just fulfilling on a very personal level in a way that money could never fulfill you. So I always had that burning desire to serve, and it hasn't changed. In many ways, yes, I've been through so much. But when I look back, it still wasn't as bad as boot camp and war. It wasn't as bad as being undercover for close to 6 years. I've done some very dangerous things and things that really made me reach deep down and have the intestinal fortitude to get through some really tough times. This was no different, but none of those experiences have changed the fact that I love this country enough to give my life for it, and I'm effective and good at it. If you look at my congressional record, the 4 years that I served Staten Island and Brooklyn, it was a very successful and effective record.
And in terms of that, in terms of politics, as they say, politics is all local. You represented Staten Island and Brooklyn. According to Assemblywoman Nicole Maliotakis, she says cases of human trafficking are now up 50% across the city, at least since you left office. And many of those have been tied to Asian massage parlors that have been cropping up all over Staten Island and across New York, really. How do you think lawmakers should address this problem?
Look, this has been an ongoing issue for decades, and there are no easy answers. There's no silver bullets. But what people forget about prostitution is the human, what you just mentioned, the human trafficking element to this. And that, in my opinion, is arguably the most heinous, most egregious crime you could ever perpetrate. And many times it's against minors, it's against children. You know, so they're abducting, and through trickery and through kidnapping in all different ways, these very young girls from across the world, but you're absolutely right, predominantly Asian countries, and putting them into this life of servitude and prostitution. And no one has really, and it's been growing rather than changing the trajectory. How crime has, we've had a steady decline over the last decade, but yet this is one area where we really haven't had a decline, we've had an increase. So I think it's a matter of priorities. We are plagued right now with an opioid epidemic, which is and should be, front and center. That should be obviously one of the things that our law enforcement is working on. But that's a much more complex issue, much further beyond law enforcement. Law enforcement is not going to be able by themselves to fix the opioid epidemic. We've lost the war on drugs. We have to accept that we need a different approach. So putting that aside, I think it is a little different when it comes to what you're talking about, human trafficking and the prostitution. That law enforcement can play a better role. And I think the biggest issue is a lack of coordination between federal agencies that, let's say, monitoring the flow of human trafficking into the country, and then the local police departments, such as the NYPD, to be able to coordinate effectively when the transition happens from a federal crime to now the more local issue of the massage parlors. So that, I think the real answer here is better coordination between the city, state, and federal government, and to put together specific task forces that are trained, probably with the federal government, federal training to deal with human trafficking and this exact type of crime. Because this is certainly something, that we should be able to get a handle on, and we should be able to have at least an effective urgent plan that should take a lot of time.
And given your background in law enforcement yourself, and on the flip side, you've been on the Hill. You were on the Hill. You were reelected to office. Do you think this is a failure by lawmakers on the Hill, or do you think it's simply a breakdown from there all the way down to local law enforcement?
Well, I think it's a failure at every level, and I think part of it is that it mixes into the immigration argument. Regardless of where you stand on immigration, when you have open borders, it's not just the poor indigent families that are looking for a better life that are crossing. It's also the mules that are crossing with drugs, and what I'll call coyotes that are bringing in, these poor young underage women from all over the world. It's not, Asia and Latin America, South America. So that's a big part of it too. We do need to secure our borders once and for all. So that becomes another major hurdle for these, these criminals that are kidnapping these young girls or tricking them, thinking they're going to become models or actresses or whatever it may be, and they put them into this life of servitude and make prostitutes and all drug addicts out of them. So again, I think it all stems, yes, the federal government should be taking the lead. They should be providing, not only leading the way from law enforcement, starting with our borders and with everything we can do to prevent human trafficking, but then also with the resources and training for local governments. And again, the cooperation. There's just not a lot of communication, enough communication anyway, between state and local officials and the federal government.
Okay, so it really is a top down and the other way around. Everyone's just gotta communicate better, it sounds like. And you are also a supporter of President Trump. Do you think this will harm or help your candidacy, specifically among the Asian American demographic, albeit small in Staten Island, something like 0.2%? But do you think your support of President Trump is going to help or hurt?
I don't think it's much of a factor with the Asian community. It is a small community here in Staten Island, but it is growing. The Chinese American community is growing, is one of the fastest growing groups here in Staten Island. But my Brooklyn side, I also have Southwest Brooklyn, and for example, Bensonhurst is predominantly Chinese now. Used to be Italian going back decades ago, and has shifted to a predominantly Chinese. So we have quite a bit of Chinese community here. What I do notice, though, and it's unfortunate, is that I find that the Asian communities are reluctant to get involved in the political discourse. Many of them don't vote. Many of them do not want to get involved. And I understand if you recently come here from China, you don't want anything to do with that. So what I find with a lot of the older people in the Asian communities, that they still have somewhat of a fear of the government, only because they're used to coming from communist China. So that's something I think we need to overcome. New York City does a pretty good job of putting literature in various different Asian languages and so on, doing outreach. But we need to do more. But I do believe it's going to take a generation or two for them, for the Asian Americans now settling into these areas, to get a little more comfortable with the process, and to feel, quite frankly, to feel that that they can be involved in a government process without any adverse reprisals.
And lastly, the atmosphere and the landscape on Capitol Hill has changed quite a bit since you left only a few years ago, and the Republican Party seems to be fractured, perhaps even divided. It's divided into kind of the establishment type and folks like you, who appear to be the disruptors to the status quo, the new disruptors such as yourself, all across the country in races we've seen across the special election races across the country, seem to have been getting the backing of Steve Bannon. Will we see Steve Bannon and his team out in force for you later this year? And have you and your team and maybe the Bannon team, have you discussed rallying the minority vote?
No, not specifically. You're correct in the sense that there is a bit of a fracture, but I think it's long overdue. People see candidates like myself, and I think I'm a little bit unique. Again, I ran back in 2010 the first time. Part of that was because I saw that the establishment wasn't being effective, and I don't think that establishment politics for either side is necessarily good, because it leads to complacency, and we do need new blood in every party. It's new ideas and energy and enthusiasm, which was lacking. And unfortunately, especially in Washington, it's easy after so many years to just go along to get along, so to speak. I've never been that way. I believe in term limits. I don't believe in career politicians. I just think after a certain amount of time, you can't be as effective. You lose the fire in the belly after so many years of doing it. And it's very hard to stay in government for a long time and not become cynical. So that's just a fact, which really has nothing to do with Republican or Democrat. It really goes across the party lines, and that's just what I think about all government. If you're in government for too long, you tend to become a bureaucrat, and bureaucrats are not very effective at implementing policy. It's a lot easier to just say, well, that's the way it's always been, so let's just keep doing it, even though it's not working. So I think my candidacy represents a little bit of a breath of fresh air to say we're not going to do things as we always did. We're going to do them differently, and I can rely on the 4-year track record that I had, where I got a lot done. I mean, in my 4 years, I passed more legislation than almost any other member during that 4-year tenure. And that's because, I wasn't burnt out, so to speak. I wasn't consistent. I had the fire in the belly, and I was willing to do things a different way rather than the way it's always been done. So I don't know if this really affects the Asian American community. Again, I think for me, what I'm seeing in my district is the biggest hurdle for candidates is really overcoming the obstacle of lack of participation by the Asian American community, how to get them engaged. And there's also sometimes a communication barrier, obviously, but it's a lack of enthusiasm to get involved in the political arena. So that's the biggest thing I see as the challenge for all candidates as we have a growing Asian American population.
And is Steve Bannon going to be out with you on the campaign trail stumping?
I don't know anymore because, after the comments came out in that salacious book, I reached out to Steve Bannon to find out, if he actually made those comments or not. You didn't hear back, and I had to take a pretty harsh stance, unfortunately, because at the end of the day, I support our president. He's our commander in chief, and I'm always going to choose my country and my commander in chief over all else. I'm always going to be loyal to the United States of America. So I was pretty harsh in my comments. It's not personal at all. I wish Steve Bannon the best of luck. I hope he does, very, very well. But I'm not sure how much we'll actually be working together as we go forward.
All right, fair enough. We will leave that. Thank you so much for joining me today on this very important kickoff of Slanted Online. Former Congressman Mike Grimm looking to get his seat back, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much for taking time to talk with us today.
Thank you. I hope to come back soon.
Please do. Always welcome. Thank you.